the endeavor for order and cleanliness. And we first take the question of cleanliness as the progress of culture. Dirt is the sign of barbarism, cleanliness is the sign of cultural progress. And this is Freud says the yardstick of civilization and progress is the use of soap. Well, what is culture when we use soap? And culture always begins with, well, hygiene. You know? Like, quote from Freud, dirtiness of any kind seems to us incompatible with civilization. So what is this strive for cleanliness? And it's intriguing because there's something at stake in it which is not reducible to the function of survival. But of course, cleanliness greatly enhances the longevity and the chances of survival. But animals do pretty much very well without, and the knowledge of all the blessings of cleanliness, it's actually quite recent data. I mean, try to survive in a medieval city. Completely horrible. So there is something which is beyond the question of health or survival or something in cleanliness. There's a drive inscribed in this, and there's a tacit supposition between about the link between the filth and the body, between the filth and enjoyment. So there's some enjoyment, there's something dirty enjoyment which has to be dealt with. One has to. There's a question of purification, a question of ascesis. One has to rise above this dirtiness of enjoyment, purification, liberation from the flesh. But the moment one does this, and this is the big question, the trouble, this disentanglement from the filthy bodily enjoyment itself produces an excessive enjoyment. It produces an excessive enjoyment, a surplus enjoyment. There's a surplus enjoyment precisely in this purification, in this renunciation of purely filthy bodily enjoyment. And one can see that traditionally purification, ascesis, was always the metaphor of the spirit elevated over carnality. And Freud always comes back to this. It all stems from what? From our control over excremental function. The regulation of the excremental function, the confinement to a particular place, the scattering. You know, if you bring a child to a kindergarten, they say, is this child clean? So any child 1 year old can immediately understand what is the first step of civilization. Like what divides the human from subhuman. You can see that this is crystal clear. And for Freud, this is the question of the anal stage. It's precisely the question of the anal drive. Like, bodily functions have to be disciplined, and the disciplining of the anal function is the model of every discipline. And any transgression of this evokes this dirty enjoyment, this band link between filth and enjoyment. And you can see the animals have no such problems. They don't generally find excrements repulsive or odorous. And I quote from Freud from the 3 essays, so there's the prohibition to feel pleasure with the anal activity and its products, and this becomes the measure of the development. This is the occasion when the infant must for the first time experience a surrounding which is hostile to his instinctual impulses. He has to learn to distinguish between his own being and the stranger's, and then perform the first repression of his capacities for pleasure. And since becomes the symbol for everything that has to be rejected and excluded from life. So this is the whole question of the anal stage in the development of the drive. I mean, the oral stage stems from the need to be fed, and it's sort of grafted on this need to be fed. But the anal stage, not at all. I mean, the anal stage always stems from the demand of the other. So the other has to make this imposition, this regulation, discipline. The object of the anal stage is always the demand of the other.
In what sense?
Well, you can see that there is nothing. I mean, there's a universe logic. In the oral drive, okay, you want to be fed, and inside of feeding, you get an excessive enjoyment, sucking the thumb is for Freud, the first minimal sort of appearance of the oral drive. Because you suck the thumb just for the pleasure. This excess of pleasure is somehow being autonomized, becomes independent from the need to be fed. So this something, the surface pleasure, the oral pleasure, can be easily autonomized. This is the beginning of this departure of the drives from the natural needs. Within the natural needs, you have a departure. There's a cleanup, there's a deviation from the natural needs. But in the anal stage, there is nothing in anality which would be the equivalent. You have to have the demand of the other, which imposes this. It comes from outside. It comes from the dialectics with the involvement with the other.
Oh, I get your point. Yes.
Yeah. This is the object, and that there is a different kind of logic, different kind of temporality of this. And Lacan somewhere speaks. It's actually quite funny. He speaks about elephant shit. He speaks about elephants. There must be huge amounts of this. This comes in vast quantities. But there is no problem in nature. They somehow dispose of this. Have you ever heard that there would be a problem with this? Elephants live happily with this huge amounts of elephant shit. But we have this problem. He says that civilization c'est le cloaque. Civilization is a cloaque. This is the beginning of civilization. You need to dispose. You need to dispose of this thing. It has to be somewhere out of sight. There has to be regulation. So this would be the third element. You can see that the third element is not based again on general utility. Animals are very happily live with a huge amount of shit if needs be. But we have a problem. So there is a libidinal investment. There's a drive investment in this question. And then there is the fourth trait, which is a striving for order. And order in the initial gesture, culture takes the natural cycle as the model for the order. You can see that the order is first thing, the model for order is like astronomic cycles, the rhythm of day and night, the seasons, the movement of celestial bodies. And these are the basis for the first calendar. And the calendar is the elementary disposition, ordering, partitioning time. And all these monuments of civilization, pyramids, Stonehenge, are precisely this kind of imposing a celestial order on our social being. There is a question of economy of time and space. Order economizes time and space. It's economic use of divine and the other. But Freud himself says the functional use, order is useful in some sense. But this usefulness actually disguises something else. And this is a quote from Freud, order is a kind of compulsion to repeat. So at the moment you have order, again you have a surplus libidinal investment in this. You're compulsed to repeat. You cannot do otherwise. So drives, and this is always, this compulsion to repeat is always inscribed in drives. Drives always come back to the same place. They come back to the place of the crime. They come back to the place of satisfaction. And this is what conditions order. So there's a kind of blind automatism in the drive, which entails repetition. And repetition of something pleasurable, but then enigmatically also repetition of something which is beyond the pleasure principle. And Freud's famous text, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is based precisely on this enigma. Why would one want to repeat something which is beyond pleasure? Okay, one repeats something which is pleasurable. This is common sense. This may be understandable. But why the hell is human psyche structured like this? to come back to the most unpleasurable, can't get rid of the trauma. Repeating the automatism of repeating. There's an automatism of repetition which is again heedless, which doesn't care about our well-being. It just repeats itself. And we see that Freud himself says utility doesn't explain this cultural compulsion and repetition and order. Something else must be at work in this. Der Nutzen erklärt das Streben nicht ganz. Es muss etwas anderes im Spiel sein. Something else is at stake in this order, coming back, this regulation, repetitive pattern of order. Then there is the fifth trait. And I'm following Freud's script, basically. The fifth trait is the question of spirituality, ideas, and ideals. The leading role ascribed to ideas in human life as a sign and measure of civilization. And again, this comes to something, to sort of enigmatic, problematic, paradoxical trait of the drive, which Freud early on called sublimation. So, what is this? Why are drives so easily sublimated? And one can see that it's really sort of Freud's problem is the reverse of what is usually taken to be psychoanalysis. Like what is usually taken to be psychoanalysis sort of pansexuals. Behind every high ideal, there is some dirty sexual secret. So this is what really drives us. And Freud's problem is completely different. It was the question of sublimation as desexualization. Why the hell would sexual drives so easily be lured to substitutes? Why would they be desexualized? How come that the human drive is structured in this way, this capacity for sublimation? And I quote from Freud, the capacity to exchange its originally sexual aim for another one, which is no longer sexual but which is psychically related to the first aim, is called the capacity for sublimation. And this drive has the curious ability to displace its aim without materially diminishing in intensity. It doesn't diminish in intensity, and it gets another kind of desexualized aim instead of the true sexual sort of satisfaction. And what is more, and I quote from Freud again, this is really astounding, this happens without involving repression. So this is really unexpected. I mean, this is really what one wouldn't expect Freud to say. So one would think that the deflection from the aim of this original purpose from sexuality would come with a high price. But Freud says this is very strange, but sublimation averts from its aim without involving repression. It just fights a surrogate, the real thing, without imposing repression. So, there is something in these vicissitudes of the drives, which is a kind of, there is a capacity, there's an original capacity for substitution. Drives have an original capacity for substitution. And one would comes to this paradox that drives are not at all the primary given. They are a natural primary given. They present a problem because they can be so easily lured away from natural means. They are so easily deceived by substitutes. And so the drives, instead of being these giants which always force their way to satisfaction, appear to be easily tamed by stand-ins, prone to sublimation, deflection from the true satisfaction. They get a satisfaction through a roundabout way. They get a satisfaction, they always get a satisfaction. But this is an ersatz satisfaction, a surplus satisfaction, not a direct satisfaction. And this roundabout is going around the object, like Lacan will insist on this, is what defines the drive. So, drive is a roundabout. It's not a straight way to satisfaction, it's a roundabout satisfaction. And let me come to the sixth trait of culture, which is the regulation of social relations, which enables the coexistence of family, society, and state. So, hypothetical natural state, there will be supremacy of physical power, but society requires mutual limitation. The idea of law and justice, which will be equally valid for everyone, and if everyone is submitted to a law, then everyone has to accept renunciation of drives. Everyone has to renounce. Everyone has to equally renounce. This is the basic idea of society. There must be restriction of our freedom and autonomy. And society always means heteronomy. Something is imposed, we must renounce. And here, we come back to this question of renunciation and why are we so unhappy in culture? And Freud uses a number of terms. He says Triebverzicht, which is renunciation of drives. He says Nichtbefriedigung, the non-satisfaction, dissatisfaction. He says Unterdrückung, which is suppression. Verdrängung, repression. He says Kulturversagen, cultural renunciation. This is a kind of ambiguous term in German because one may understand that one has to renounce in favor of culture. Or else, Kulturversagen can also mean culture always fails. I mean, there's something in culture which fails. And then he speaks of Triebeinschränkung, which is limitation of the drives, and finally, and this is a crucial word, Zielgehemmung, which means inhibition of the drive on the way to its goal. The drive is always somehow inhibited on the way to its goal. This is the position of the culture, but it nevertheless attains its aim. Lacan will insist on this